Before sunrise, the gods would exhale a breath of iron-cold air that combed the leaves and set the little stream to a brighter murmur. Jon stood where the stepping stones were slick with film, one hand on Ghost's ruff, steadying himself more than the wolf. The heart tree stared at him as if it had always known he would choose this hour and this place. Its carved eyes were dark with sap, and the pale bark took on a subtle sheen where frost had grazed it, as if it wore its own winter mail. He had come here for quiet and for that feeling of being seen without being judged, a feeling the rest of Winterfell could seldom give him. Ghost's ears turned as if they listened below the snow, through root and rock, for some older conversation. The sky beyond the walls had the thin gray of quenching iron. He'd been away from the hall since they began the first scouring. The day before had been vinegar and brooms and voices rising up to rafters as every floor was beaten and every bench sanded smooth, as if a king might choose to peer under the rushes to decide whether the north pleased him. The thought made him smile without humor. He might have slept better if a king had not been about to ride up to their gate with a golden pride of cats in his wake. He had stirred every time the fire on his hearth settled and ash breathed. He had counted the beams overhead. He had half dreamt of antlers and thunder. Ghost raised his head, tasting the air as if someone walked in a far part of the wood. The gods would did that, made distances strange, a trick of the pond's mirror and the red leaves lifting and settling like a held breath. Jon bent to touch the wolf's skull lightly, then straightened at the soft crunch of steps behind him. He turned before the shape came into sight, and was not surprised. His father moved like a tall pine casting its own weather. In the cold, steam rose briefly from his mouth when he breathed. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that no one could smooth from them. The North wrote its letters on every face it claimed. His cloak hung heavy and beaded with the frost that had caught it between hall and tree. He did not at once speak, and Jon, who had learned all his life to measure the space between words with patience, bowed his head. The heart tree watched both of them. Eddard Stark joined him without an apology, without explanation. That was the Stark way. The explanation, when it came entire or not at all. He took in the wolf, the water, and his son, and something in his face that usually held steady as stone seemed to loosen, as if a thaw had started behind his eyes and he did not welcome it. "Walk with me," he said at last, not loud, as if to disturb the white leaves would be discourtesy. His voice made breath into mild fog. Jon did. They circled the pond and then took the little path that threaded through thorn and trunk and came to the closed dark where the older pines stood shoulder to shoulder. Here, even in daylight, it was always a shade darker, always a little cooler. Ghost followed at a pace that kept the distance equal, quiet as he always was. "Your aunt used to come here in the morning," Lord Stark said, staring ahead rather than at the boy beside him. "She liked the pond best when the surface was a little skinned with ice, thin, ready to break." The world quivered. Jon kept his jaw still and his eyes on the path, because his father rarely spoke of her, and when he did it was with a tone that lifted every little hair along the back of Jon's neck and made gratitude feel like trespass. "I've heard," Jon said softly, though he had not in this way. "Old Nan told me she was quick, and she laughed. From what I gather of laughing." "From what you gather?" Eddard Stark echoed and almost smiled. The expression did not hold. He slowed. It was a deliberate slowing, as if choosing where to put his feet was not only a matter of avoiding stones. "There is something I have kept from you," he said in the same calm voice. "I thought I would hold it longer. I have thought that many times. But the keeping is beginning to do harm that the telling may undo. I know that much." Jon's heart took a kind of misstep, and he waited to see if it righted. He felt the trick of his own breath, the way it wanted to climb and leave him breathless. He swallowed and put his hand on Ghost again, not so much for comfort now as to keep it from shaking and giving him away. My lord," he managed. He hated how quickly the old habit of "my lord" came to rescue him when uncertainty opened under his boots. He hated how it made him a distance away and safe. Eddard Stark stopped and turned. Their boots had made an oval of tamped snow. His father's eyes had a tired honesty in them. Snow caught on his beard and melted to small beads. "Look at me, John," he said. John looked. It was not the look of a lord to his son now, nor a master to his ward. It was a man trying to make his mouth serve him and knowing his mouth would use him, as every honest mouth does, if he let it. "There are some truths," Lord Stark said carefully, "that do more good by the telling and some by the carrying. The truth I have carried for you has done you and others both, for good and ill. I do not know now whether I have chosen rightly, only that the seasons are turning and a king is on our road, and I am tired of thinking about what will break and when. It is time you knew the shape of the danger you have walked in since the day you breathed your first breath." He paused as if the wind would finish for him. It did not. The gods would kept its counsel. "What danger?" John asked, because it was better to give words something to do than to let them stampede. There was no gentler path, and Lord Stark took no detour. "You are my son," he said, "but not by the law." He held up a hand as something flared in John's chest. "Hear me. You are the son of my sister and of a man who died in a river wearing rubies." The sound in John's ears was winter itself, a long, thin ringing. He thought he had understood the world well enough to walk it. He thought he had understood how pain came to him and where to put it so as not to spill it on the floor and make a mess of the day. He did not understand this. He had wondered, when he was smaller and the questions were like loose stones in his pockets, whether some village boy had been caught, whether a serving girl with a kindness in her eyes had tilted her head on some summer night and let his father be less allured. He had tried a dozen faces on a woman he had never met, all of them soft and mortal and near. He had never dared to put a crown on that unknown head, or a song. He wanted to breathe and could not immediately do it. Ghost placed one paw forward and touched his boot, light as if to remind him of weight. "Say it," John said, and did not know why he wanted the knife to have a name. "Rhaegar," said Eddard Stark, and the name moved in the air with a strange lightness, as if it remembered being sung once. "And Lyanna." The boy's body did not know what to do with the words it had been given. His hands felt colder. His face did not know whether to tighten or loosen. There was the expectation that things would tilt. They did not. The world had the insolence to remain arranged as it had been arranged, with trees and stones and a father's boots in the snow and a white wolf whose nose steamed. John lifted his head because it was either that or lower it for good. "I have been father to you," Lord Stark said very evenly, as if speaking to a man standing on a high edge with the drop behind him. "That does not change with the knowledge. If anything, I should be more so, now that we both know the hole in the snow we've been circling." "When did she—" John began, and couldn't yet use the word mother without feeling as if he were stealing. "Your sister. When did she—" He shaped the air with his hand, a helpless little twist. "She died," Eddard Stark said, and that was some mercy. That he spoke of it directly, because the ground under that word was already as worn as it would ever be. "She died in a place far from home, asking me to keep you with a fervor that burned her mouth. I carried you away while the world burned around us. I brought you into my hall. I named you mine. It was the only shield I could find that would stop a king's hate. It is the only shield that holds still." "Robert," John said. The name tasted of hooves and beer and the old stories he'd leant toward at benches, trying to drink from cups not meant for his hands. Robert had been the word men used to mean strength, and the word they used to mean sackcloth and ashes. The thought of that man's laugh, he'd heard it once, far off, from the road on a hunting day, turned sour in his stomach. He killed a man who had done harm that needed justice," said Eddard Stark, which was not quite the tale the singers favored. "He has no love for that man's name, nor any who wore it. For the sake of that hatred I built you a wall of lies and stood you behind it. I will continue to stand. But a wall is a prison sometimes as much as a fortification, and if you are to be shut in by it, you should at least know the shape of it. Listen to me, John. Hear me with all your stubbornness." John heard. He wanted to reach out and lay his hand on his father's wrist and could not. He wanted to run and could not. "Why now?" he said, because it was the only question he could make small enough to ask. "After all these years, Why tell me now? Because I am about to be handed a different kind of burden, Lord Stark said, the shadow of a bleak smile on his mouth. Because a king rides to my door to ask me for a service I do not want and am not free to refuse. Because if I take it, I will be drawn south into a coil of snakes who like to lie in sun-warmed places and bite whatever passes nearest. If I refuse it, I will make an enemy of a man who does not remain only in songs. You will be in danger while I am away, or while I am here, and either way the danger will not knock and ask if you're at home before it lets itself in. Better you know what strikes at you and why. Jon felt something like laughter, thin as ice. It did not make a sound in his throat. And what would you have me do with this? He could feel the burn in his eyes and did not look away. Shall I scratch it on the walls of the cellar? Shall I bury it where we put the turnips? Must I wear it in my boot and limp with it and never tell the maester why I limp? His father's eyes softened at anger as they never softened at complaint. I would have you live, he said. I would have you hold your tongue. I would have you see the king and keep your eyes down as you have done all your life when a man you did not trust stood in the yard. I would have you carry this as a coal you do not dare drop. I would have you know that if ever I am taken away from you, and the walls we have built around your quiet life begin to crack, there are a very few people in this world who can say your name true and make others believe it. I will write their names for you and put them where only your hand could find it. You are not alone even if I am far. Hear me again. You are not alone. Something in Jon eased with those last words in a way that made him feel both grateful and betrayed by his own body. It eased because all children ease when told they are not alone, and he was ashamed that he was still that child. He covered the shame by asking, "Who else knows? A man whose people don't spend words if they can help it, and no one who would gladly give up his lakes for a city full of candles," said his father. He was with me in that place. He knows. Others may guess. Others will tell themselves neat stories because they like neat stories. I have let them. It turns a hunting fray into a ballad if there is a lady in a tower and a chivalrous disgrace. But guesses are not arrows. They fall short. When shot up that steep. How do I look at him? Jon asked. How do I look at the king? How do I look at my brothers? He could say that word and half mean it and half not now, and there was a kind of cruelty in that. At my lady, he added, because Catelyn's face would be a new country. He did not know whether it had mountains or marshes. You look at them as you did yesterday, Eddard Stark said. You look at them as yourself. You will not call yourself by any other name. You will not dream aloud. If you need a place for your dreaming, come to the Godswood and speak to the tree, which has heard worse and better from foolish men. And when the time comes, I do not say it will, but if it does, when the time comes that someone stands before you with a knife in their mouth and a smile in their eyes and says they know the truth and they have come to help you, you will turn and run, because a true friend never arrives with a riddle. Do you understand me? With some part of me, Jon said. Another part is far away, looking down into a pond and seeing a face it does not recognize. He felt slight madness like a light wind. Past. He straightened. Is there proof? It was a shameful, necessary thing to ask. Or is it only your word? My word ought to be enough, Eddard Stark said. There was no sting in it. If there was, it was directed at himself. But yes, there are proofs that will suit a hard-nosed man who likes to stack seals like firewood. They are hidden in a place that listens to me. I will take you there later, when the hall is sleeping and the cooks are drunk and the guards are cold. He hesitated, and then, as if he made himself move through syrup, he reached into his cloak and drew out a small parcel wrapped in an old square of linen. He looked at it as a man looks at a wound he knows better than his own palm. This is not proof for the world, he said quietly. This is a proof for you. Keep it. Or throw it into the pond and watch it sink if it is too much to hold. Jon took the linen without opening it. The cloth was worn thin at one corner, and someone had mended it with thread not quite the same color as the rest. He put it inside his jerkin, above his ribs. It warmed there. He thought he could feel it like a second, small heartbeat. They walked again. He could not afterward recall the path they took, or how soon his father left him, only that he stood at last again before the heart tree with ghost pressed against his leg and the cold biting the damp at his lashes. He lowered himself to the root that made a natural seat and stayed there until the light was stronger and voices began in the yard. The sound of buckets being set down, the rhythm of brooms, kennelmen calling dogs off and on. He opened the linen then, his hands strangely calm. Inside lay a twist of hair bound with blue thread, dark hair shot through with a few lighter strands, and a small ring so plain that it only drew attention by how much it refused ornament. The ring was narrow. The metal had been polished by skin until it had a soft luster like worn bone. He did not know whether to think of a girl who had worn it or a man who had taken it off the dead. He held the hair to his face and smelled the faintest suggestion of something sweet under old linen and old iron. Not a perfume, not an herb. It was the memory of summer in a place that rarely forgave summer for its carelessness. He put it away again. He breathed. He counted the branches above him once and once more, and then went back through the wood and out into the yard with a face he had taught all his life to show the world when it needed nothing from him. The day moved like a heavy wagon whose wheels stuck sometimes and sometimes rolled free. The kitchens belched steam. Banners were shaken from poles. Every step in the great hall sounded overly loud because the rushes had been fresh laid and were slicker than old ones. The men at the gate rolled their shoulders and pretended to be idle only because they had polished everything else already and needed their hands to be useless a while. Rob crossed the yard with Theon beside him, both of them in breeches scuffed at the knee, laughing at something one of the kennel pups had done, and caught John's eye as if there had never been any doubt whose eye he would want to catch. Rob's face had that open joy to it that made John feel a weight in his chest. Theon's grin was hungry and practiced. "Come on," Rob called. "Ben's down in the stable saying the king will want to see the gray, old as it is, for luck. He's teasing Jory to distraction. He says he'll make a crow out of me and send me to the wall to knock the icicles down." John touched Ghost's ear in excuse and shook his head. "I've things to see to," he said, and hated how often that lie served him too. Rob opened his mouth, then looked toward the house where a shadow had passed behind one of the lower windows, and he nodded. He always saw more than he admitted. "Later then," he said, and cuffed Theon when Theon made a face John would rather not have to answer. Caitlin Stark had been that shadow. She came down a moment after as if the air had parched and narrowed around her, as if even the yard's open space crowded her. She did not avoid John when he stood directly in her path as she had, at times, when their movement in the house had been like the careful patterns of people carrying hot soup and not wanting to collide. She stopped a yard away. The tilt to her chin was not disdain. It had never been only that. He saw now, with eyes hurriedly and painfully new, that the tilt had always been a brace against pain, a bit of bone to keep from crying out when the wood struck. "My lady," he said. "John," she returned. She used his name when no one else was close. She had always used his name too sparingly for a woman who warmed a hall with her presence. She looked at his face as if she could smell something singed in the air and did not know whether. The fire was within her walls or without. "There is much to be done," she said, as if reporting to him. "Aye," he answered. He almost said more, something strange and generous. It will be all right, perhaps, though he did not know if it would be, and did not. She stood a heartbeat longer, then passed him, her skirts whispering, the sense of cedar and soap lingering like a closed book left open half a finger's width. He found Arya later where he expected her least and most, on the inner stair between kitchens and armory, perched on a step, her knees up to her chin, boots muddy where they had no business being muddy. She had Ghost's patience in waiting and his sudden startle of joy when she saw John, which made him have to look away because joy did this day no favors. But he could not refuse her it. "They're saying the queen has hair like wheat," she told him from first breath, foregoing greeting. "Sansa says it's like sunlight in braids." I made a face and she pinched me on the arm. Maidens are full of pinches. She says the queen's little brother is clever and wicked both. Theon says wicked is what men who cannot do something call men who can. "You shouldn't stand too near Theon when he's talking," John said, and Arya pulled a strand of hair from her mouth and grinned. "Can't always help where he stands. He fills up the air." She peered at his face, her own quick as greenhouse birds. startling, darting. "What's wrong with you?" "Nothing," he told her. "Came too quickly." "You lie wrong," she said, not unkindly. "Your mouth is still. When Rob lies, his mouth gets full like a pastry. When Sansa lies, she looks in a mirror as if she's seeing someone else do it better. You go still and quiet, and it makes me think of the pond under ice." She reached into some hidden fold of herself and produced a half-mangled oatcake, held it in her palm for him. "Have it. I stole two. The first one was for me. This one could be for you. Or it could be for Ghost." Her eyes went sly. "Or for some other creature who skulks." She never said Catelyn's name in that tone. She had never risked Jory's hearing with that tone. She used it now because they were alone and she was being kind with a child's bluntness, which is the only time bluntness is kindness. Jon took the cake. "Share it," he said. They did, crumbling it into equal pieces with their dirty fingers. And Ghost licked the crumbs where they fell and pretended he hadn't been waiting for exactly that. "Are you coming to the hall to watch them come in?" Arya asked with her mouth full. "If we climb up to the beam on the left, I can see down into the Queen's hair and tell Sansa whether it is like wheat or more like cat's fur." "I'll find you," Jon said. He would not. He had already been told he might keep to the shadows, and if his father had not forbidden the main welcome, his lady had found some polite machinery by which to bar him from it. He hadn't pushed. He rarely pushed. It had been wiser not to long before he learned wisdom. He put the last of the cake into her hand and stood. "Stay off the walls," he told her, because it was a thing to say that a brother might say, and because the thought of Bran spidering upward had started to make a new sort of fear move at the base of his skull and whisper. She rolled her eyes and lit away like a bird. He watched her until the stare made her one more shadow among shadows. The horns sounded later, a layered brazen cry that made the dogs in the kennels sing, and the air thicken with a tart excitement. Winterfell arranged itself for show. The walls were manned. The gate yawned open with a seriousness it rarely had to take on. The small folk of the town drew nearer with chatter that had caution in it like an edge turned inward. He stood in the curtained walk along the inner wall where he could see down without being seen easily. Ghost pressed his cold nose into Jon's palm once, a demand and an assurance both. The king's party was wider than the road could be at once, and yet it came through somehow. Horses nose to tail and pennons snapping, guards banging spear shafts against shields in what men called music when men did not have time for the real thing. There were men in leather and mail with faces that looked as if sand had abraded them for years and could not smooth them. There were Lannister men glittering, and behind them the sight of the Queen's litter with its pale curtains fluttering like fish gills. There were the bright prancing fools who insisted on coats of color so loud they made the day seem darker by contrast. And there were tired men whose tiredness did not lessen them. Then the king himself came into the yard as if he were riding into a memory he had once liked and found altered. Jon had not stood so close to him before. He had seen him at a distance in hunts and once in a dream, and once carved crudely on a tavern sign in a hamlet south of Winterfell where someone had taken a hatchet to the nose on the carving because the beer had been bad that year. Up close the man looked less like a song and more like a story a man tells when he is very drunk and very tired, about how there was a time he could run and now there is a time he cannot. He laughed, too loudly, and slapped Eddard Stark on the upper arm as if he were testing whether he was still there beneath his furs, which he was. Cersei Lannister sat beside him that first hour with not much expression at all. A woman who had decided that if she could not show pleasure without giving something away, she would show nothing and keep everything. Her hair did gleam like wealth in a harvest field. Sansa would be right enough. Arya would be more right, saying it looked like something that would snag under a boy's muddy fingers. He watched the greeting, the formalities, the kneeling and the rising and the turning of heads. The king lifted his arms as if to draw the whole hall into an embrace, and yet his eyes slid sometimes to the edges, measuring shadow. He was careful not to let anyone see him be careful. He watched Eddard lift his head and meet the king's gaze as if they had known each other before they knew themselves. He saw the way his father's mouth thinned when Robert said something with a roar that made men in the back laugh because they thought roars were for laughing at. He could not hear the words. He saw them and the long history that threaded them. Jaime Lannister he saw too. standing some paces off with a kind of bored grace, hair the color of something ripe and armor that fit him as if he'd been poured into it and left to harden. Men stared the way they stare when something fine and terrible stands near, like a lion that has chosen, for a moment, not to bite. Tyrion Lannister was not in the first press. He came in after, riding a shaggy little horse that looked twice as big for bearing him, looking around with interest as if he had arrived at a play and had been told, quietly, that he might be asked to come on stage later and did not mind. He looked up at the ramparts and then down at the flagstones as if both things were equally worth cataloging. His mouth made shapes as if he were talking to himself and liked the talk. Jon let the curtain fall back over the slit in the wall and stepped away. He did not think he could bear to watch more. The face of the man who had killed his father's father, no. He corrected himself because this new knowledge demanded new care. The face of the man who had killed his father, almost, and had killed his father's sister's husband at least, was not something to put in his mouth if he could help it. He went down the walk and out into the lesser court, knowing where men would not be because they would not think there was enough room for pleasure there. Ghost moved with him, always slightly ahead or behind, a white shadow. Benjen Stark found him in the armory yard, as Jon had hoped and dreaded he would. Benjen had winter's humor, slow and dry, and eyes that could make a young man feel he had been seen and not found wanting, or found wanting and still liked, which is sometimes greater mercy. He leaned against one of the pillars and watched Jon work a strap that did not need working. "So," Benjen said, "you mean to go to the wall with me when the king has been fed and put to bed and men have had their fill of boasting?" "I've thought of it," Jon answered, though he had thought of little else the past month. Measuring the choice as boys measure a puddle's depth with a stick and pretend it is the sea. He had said it to himself already. The black would be a way not to be asked to choose too many other things. Even before this morning, it had held a cool appeal. A place with straight rules where his name would be merely a name and not a commentary. After this morning, the idea had the chill of a cloak held out in winter. He almost clutched at it. "You've thought of it," Benjen mocked gently. "Have you thought of what you're unlikely to be allowed to do at the wall? Have you thought of the through draft? Of frost in your nostrils so thick you'll think you're breathing a cloud and then you'll cough ice? I've thought of where else I am likely to go and how men will say my name there," Jon said, a shade too sharply. He was ashamed of it at once. Benjen, who had never demanded anything of him but the truth, took it and did not make it weigh more than it weighed. "You have the north in the set of your eyes," Benjen said, a little smiling. "You'll do well in cold places. You'll learn to keep your candle under your cloak when the wind is rude. If you come to the wall, go because you choose it, not because you can't think of where else to go. I won't be another man whose needs make your choices for you. Do you hear me, boy?" Jon nodded and found, unexpectedly, his throat tight. "I hear." Benjen let a silence sit like a third person with them, then shifted. "If you come," he said, "I will see you treated as I treat any man I like. That will be kindness on days and an irritation on others. I'll not be your mother. I'll be worse. I will make you rise earlier than you wish. I will take your pride apart, and then hand the pieces back to you so you can learn to assemble it yourself. There is all sorts at the wall. You will like some and some will not like you. You will learn the names of the hills by the way the wind goes round them. You will learn that a man can laugh when he is too cold for tears. If that sounds like a prayer, it is the kind we pray up there. What if," Jon began, and cut himself off before he could say the thing he was not to say. He swallowed and tried to shape a different question out of the pieces he could use. "What if a man has more reasons than one for wanting a cold place?" "A cold place makes a good cupboard for hot reasons," said Benjen Stark, watching his face with that grave kindness again. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps men always guessed around a secret and only pretended they hadn't for pity's sake. "Think on it. The king will not ride out before 7 days. If you mean to come with me, tell me before I leave and we'll find you a horse that won't hate you for being young and eager. A horse that will forgive you for thinking that is all there is to riding." When Benjen had gone, Jon stood in the yard with the afternoon sliding toward evening and the air going more blue between buildings. He did not know what to do with himself, which was a new problem and not new at all. He went and found Ghost a bone stolen from the kitchens and watched him carry it off to gnaw in the kennel shadows. He watched the grooms curry the chestnut mare Sansa liked best until her coat shone as if it had drunk all that light in. He watched the sky bruise and pale again. The horn sounded for the meal, and he did not go to the hall. He had learned where to put himself to avoid the hall without making a show of avoiding it. He took a trencher in the small room near the buttery where the undercooks ate with their sleeves rolled and their gossip left in bold piles on the table between them. He listened to their talk as if it were a stream, and learned thus that the king had pinched a girl's cheek and laughed and called her little snowcat. And the girl had nearly cried, and her mother had put her hand over her mouth and pulled her back into the shadows where it was safe to cry. He learned that the queen had eaten little and looked at nothing when she could help it and always at something when she could not. He learned that the dwarf had asked 3 questions of the kitchen lad with the scar on his scalp that the lad had not understood and had bowed afterward as if the lad had done him a favor. He learned, by the way talk bent around obstacles, that Catelyn Stark had been like a rope that day and that ropes, too, can burn men's hands when they carry too much weight. He went up after to the parapet to breathe. The night had taken on that special clarity that comes after many men eat and shout under a single roof and then fall back into the cold for air. It was as if the stars had been washed for the occasion. His breath rose like ghosts. Ghost himself jumped onto the wall and paced with that attention to joy he gave to any height. Jon put a hand on his flank to steady him and to steady himself. A voice behind him said, "I was hoping to find the coldest place in the north and test a theory about whether a short man can actually freeze more quickly if he breathes through his nose instead of his mouth. I see I must have taken a wrong turn." Jon turned. The small man from the yard stood with his hands tucked into his cloak, rocking slightly on his heels as if to keep blood moving in places where the blood was reluctant. His eyes were bright and restless and old. "My lord," Jon said, and then remembered that lords came in sizes, too, and dipped his chin, uncertain how deep. "Oh, keep it," the man said merrily, as if Jon had offered him a piece of bread rather than a courtesy. "Titles are a solid meal, and I have already eaten and intend to drink. I won't take more on an empty stomach. Your head is too full. I can see it from here. Your wolf is very white. May I say something unsuitable about how often men's wolves are not so pure?" Jon did not smile. He thought he might like this man and did not trust that thought. "You may say anything," he said. "No one will complain to me. I am not the person who receives complaints in this castle. Nor am I the person who files them," the man said. He came to the parapet and put his hands on the stone and looked out over the dark. "Your name is Jon Snow. Your father is an honorable man who wears his honor like a cloak that both warms and chafes him. Your eyes say you are thinking of leaving the place where your bed knows you so well it has a depression in it that fits your shoulder. I deduce that you must be going to the wall, because no sane boy leaves a warmed house in winter for any other cold height." Jon had been told, this very day, to beware of people who came smiling with knowledge. He did not run. Some part of him wanted to laugh because if this small man were a knife, he looked one that had been dropped behind a cupboard and dulled by time. "You know a lot of things," Jon said. "I find that if I guess often and speak confidently, people are amazed by what I know," the man said. "I am less dangerous than I pretend and more than some would like. My sister would say otherwise. She would always say otherwise. She is a lady for whom contrary can be a way of breathing. Would you like advice?" "No," Jon said, and then remembered belatedly that men often asked questions whose answer they did not want. He added, "Very well. Good," said the man, pleased. "When someone offers you his name with a story attached, ask for the story quietly and the name loudly. It will confuse him. He will be forced to be what he claims, and you will often get the better of him. When someone smiles broadly as he mentions honor, put your hand over your purse. When someone speaks of the north as if it were a single room, show him a map with too many names. He will close his mouth. And when you go somewhere to become something, make sure you are not only becoming something for other men. Keep a part that is only yours." "It sounds expensive," Jon said. He heard the dryness and approved of it. "Oh, it is," the man said cheerfully. "The most expensive thing there is, being close to yourself without selling it. But you can pay in small coins daily. Also, bend your knees when you lift. Sore backs run in my family. I would not wish it on yours. Thank you, John said. He had the sensation of standing in a room that entire conversations had already passed through, and that he would later see echoes of this one on the walls. Why are you out here? He asked before he could remind himself of caution. You could be sitting by a fire that would reach your height without having to climb very far. Because I like to look at places where it's hard to see men, said the dwarf, and the cheer did not leave his voice even though the words did not suit cheer. If a man is a little, overwhelmed by a day full of other people's mouths, the stars are a relief. I may even be further from being stabbed, if no one can reach me. He put out a hand and Ghost came very near to sniff it, then chose to let the hand hover a finger's width from his nose. That is a good wolf. He is thinking about whether my head is food. He has plain tastes, John said. He wanted to ask more, to stand here and let strange counsel wash over him until he felt humor again. He did not. He thought of his father and the gods would giving him a parcel, and of words like rubies that had their own weight even after they left a body. Good night, he said. Until morning, said the dwarf. I am less good in mourning, but I am honest then by accident. He turned away and dissolved into the stairs' dark L. Like a trick done on a market day for small coins. John leaned his forearms on the parapet and closed his eyes. He let the cold creep up his sleeves and settle on his neck. When he opened them, the sky had shifted a little, a bright sliver biting the shoulder of a darker one. Ghost placed his head on John's boots and made a low sound that might have been a wolf's version of comfort. John lifted the wolf's ear and whispered into it nonsense and sense together, because that is sometimes how a boy makes words live in his mouth long enough not to choke him. He did not sleep until the fire had died and started itself again in its own ashes. In sleep he went where his will could not follow. A tower that was not Winterfell's, a bed that had smelled of old chalk, a window that had let in light like a blue blade. He walked across a floor littered with petals, and they bruised under his feet and left scent on his skin for days, not sweet so much as stubborn. A woman lay with her hair spilled out like a dark pool. Someone stood over her with a bowl and a cloth. Someone else cried without making any sound. John reached out in the dream to lift the cloth from the bowl and see what was in it. But it was only water, cold as if it had been fetched from a well at night. The water made a noise like small bells. He woke with his hand lifted from the bedclothes and opened his fingers and shook them to feel skin. Morning brought tasks. The second day of a king in a hall is always less beautiful than the first. Dust that had been cowed crept back. Tired men were less careful with their jokes. A huntsman came to the yard and boasted he could run a stag into the wall if given the right dogs. A boy from Wintertown brought hens in a basket and saw the king from across the yard and spilled the basket in surprise and made a rain of feathers no one would have thought possible. Sansa, in a dress the color of something between milk and snowmelt, walked like a dream she had taught her body to hold. Arya moved as if always clearing space in the world with her elbows and her smile. Bran climbed and climbed before any man who might have told him not to was looking. In the afternoon, Jon found his father where he had expected him, in the place where the stone was smoothed by many knees. The crypts were cool and close and honest. Men went there to tell the dead what they would not tell the living and to listen to their own voices echo in a way that made them sound wiser and more foolish both. Torches guttered and flared. Carved faces watched with stony patience. The smell was damp and old. Ghost did not like it. He came as far as the third stair and lay down and put his chin on his paws and did not move. Eddard Stark stood before his sister's stone and did not touch it. For a long time Jon did not speak, because there was something indecent about interrupting a man in the company of his dead. At last his father turned and put his hand lightly on Jon's shoulder, and that gave him permission to use the air his lungs had saved. You said last night there were proofs to satisfy men with no poetry in them, Jon said. He faltered. He felt the stone's patience and borrowed a fragment. You said there were names I might call upon if all else failed. Why not call upon them now? Why not make the truth a thing I might stand on instead of a thing I have to hide under? Because the world is not a court, Eddard Stark said. The torch near his face leapt and showed him lined and weary. Because a truth spoken aloud becomes a weapon in the room. Because men would not stop at knowing it. They would begin to wonder what it meant they might do with it. Because a king who hates the sound of a certain name might like to make a sport of hunting that name when all his other sports have gone dull. Because your mother is dead and your father is dead and neither of them can be made to say a word to aid you, and men like to build scaffolds on the silence of the dead. Because I swore. He set his jaw, and Jon saw it. The way saying I swore was both unburdening and burden. And because I am a selfish man in this and do not want to give you up yet to the world's use of you. Jon stared at the floor until it moved less. He nodded. Then I will go to the wall, he said. He had not known he would say it until he said it. The words felt like laying down a plank over a gap. I will go where names are hung at the gate and left there. I will put on black and be nothing and something. I will write to you or I will not, as letters can be knives if a man reads them who should not. I will go before I make some other mistake with this knowledge that cannot be unmade. It is not a mistake to have a truth in your keeping, Eddard said. He looked at his sister's stone again, and something crossed his face that Jon had only seen when he was much younger and had nearly died of a winter fever that had snatched people out of their beds. But it is a weight. Go then, if you are decided. You will stand a man's watch among men and boys made to stand like men. You will learn to sharpen. I will give you letters you may use if the worst comes and you cannot bring yourself to my walls. I will tell you where to look for a crannogman if your path takes you to bad places. And, he hesitated. I will tell you that I love you. It is a clumsy time to tell you and an honest one. I have not said it often because men like me were taught the word was for warmth and women and halls where wine spilled. We were not taught it for sons. We should have been. You are not less my son for what you have learned. You are feather and bone of my house whether the hawk defies the crest or sits tame on it. If someday a man tells you otherwise with a voice that sounds true, leave him to talk to stones. Something in Jon broke, a small breaking that made a wider space in him. He bowed his head so that his hair hid him and nodded until he could breathe again. He did not trust his mouth. He put 2 fingers to the carved stone's wrist where someone had carved a slender bracelet and held them there to steady himself. The stone was cold and steady. Stones are patient with boys. He left the crypts with a candle in his hand and walked to the stair where Ghost leaped up as if he had been released from a spell. The wolf pressed his shoulder against Jon's leg so hard he nearly lost his footing. We are going north, Jon told him under his breath. We will be more ourselves there or less, I cannot tell which. Ghost sneezed and shook himself and padded toward the light. The days that followed were already being spoken of even as they happened. Men like to narrate their own lives in case no singer bothers later. There was the hunt where the king rode too fast and then too slow and laughed all the while because laughter covers so many slips. There was the supper where the queen smiled with her mouth and not with her eyes and the king tangled his fingers in her hair to make a joke of its weight. And some men pretended not to see her flinch because their wives were not there to notice they were cruel. There was the hour under the keep's shadow when Sansa stood so still and so careful that a sparrow came and landed near her and Arya made a face and did a small dance because she could not stand still to save her life and would always save it by moving. There was the moment on the roof when Bran looked at the space where the wall met the sky and wanted to put his palm there. Jon packed. He did it in the plain room where he had slept since he was small enough to fit inside the big chest where he kept his blanket when he wanted to be a ship in a storm. The chest smelled of old cedar and the dust that lives inside wood. He folded and refolded the same shirt as if repeating a pattern would teach him patience. Ghost lay on the rug and watched him and did not judge him for folding badly 3 times in a row. On the table beside the small shuttered window lay the linen parcel with its soft weight. He kept reaching out to touch it with his fingertips, not enough to call touching, enough to feel the warmth it had stolen from the room. He almost opened it again. He did not. He put it at last inside the inner seam he had made in his cloak. He had sewed the seam himself last winter clumsily. It wasn't the seam a mother would have made, and its ugliness made it dear. He made his rounds of goodbyes with a care that was less than he felt and more than anyone else would have otherwise given him. He found Rob in the yard with a wooden sword and a grin that resurfaced after each hit like a seal coming up for air. They embraced hard and then stepped back and pretended not to have. "I'll come to the wall when Father lets me," Rob said. "I'll ride with you past the bar Rollins and we'll eat something vile in a poor man's hut and pretend to like it." "Do that and he'll make you stay and sweep," John said. They grinned. They both looked away quickly because if they looked too long they would have to say the word love and then they would both be made fools by it. Sansa stood in her mother's solar with a seam ripper and a patience John admired more than the dress it served. She had learned how to put up with pricking and to make it seem like a virtue. "Bring me back a piece of ice," she said with a seriousness that was not foolishness. "A little piece that did not like being broken off. I shall put it in a glass and look at it until it is gone." "It will be gone," John said lightly. "You should not love things that mean to go so quickly." "Then I should not love you," she replied softer. She lifted her eyes and they were like a river under a skim of frost. "I am glad you are brave, John. I am not glad bravery is so often used to say farewell." He did not trust his voice. He touched her wrist, quick as if he had brushed against a bee and not been stung, and left. Arya did not let him say a word before she thrust something into his hands that proved to be a bone needle. "I took it from Mother's basket," she confessed fiercely and proudly. "Now you have a needle. I shall get a sword somehow. We shall both prick something." She looked at him as if she wanted to bite and cry and laugh and run and never do any of those things. He ruffled her hair and she took it as insult and love both. Bran clung to him and did not ask what he should do next. John told him anyway, "You should choose a thing and do it entirely. If you climb, climb like the rain is coming. If you listen, listen as if you mean to answer. If you fall," he could not say if. He pulled Bran into him until they hurt each other's ribs and then let him go with a last squeeze that said what he would not say with his mouth. Catelyn Stark stood at the foot of the stair that led to the door. She had not sent for him. He had come because to leave without passing her would make a lie out of everything. Her hands were clasped and white. "I will not apologize," she said at once, as if she had been waiting with the words in her mouth and could keep them no longer. They were not the words he would have thought she had been waiting to say, and that made him stand straighter. "I will not apologize for everything. I will not tell you I was wrong to keep my children near my fear. But I will say this. You have never been unkind to me when I have been less than kind to you. That is a better thing than apology, though apology is cheap and useful. You have chosen a hard road. Be careful whose hands you take on it." He had always imagined, when he imagined a kindness from her, that it would be the kind that washed all previous unkindnesses away. He had never imagined one that kept them and turned them slowly over so that both sides could be seen and found real. It was more painful and more honest. "I will," he said, and bowed to her like the lady she was and the stepmother she had been and the wall she had, sometimes, been forced to be. He thought for an instant would touch his hair. She did not. Eddard rode with him as far as the milepost where the King's Road shrugged off the last of Winterfell's shelter and became itself. They did not speak much on the ride because they did not have to and because words that had been said so recently still clung to their mouths. Ben-Jen was there already, turning his horse in small circles as if reminding it which way a circle went. Yoren, the black-frocked brother of the Night's Watch, had come too, with his battered hat and his patience with bad roads. A few boys from the town, sour and eager both, had collected with bundles tied in strings that would hurt their shoulders before the first dusk. Some men who had been given the choice between rope and black wore the expression of men who have eaten too much and must run. John looked at them and looked away. Eddard put a small leather packet into John's hand while Ben-Jen was telling a story about a hawk and a rabbit that no one was listening to and everyone enjoyed. "The names," he said. "Use them if you must. Burn them if you can. Find Howland Reed if ever you are more lost than you know how to be." "I will," John said. He did not open the packet. He had had enough of opening things and finding inside them other lives that were his. He leaned from his saddle and put his brow briefly against his father's shoulder like a child who has been allowed one last headlong privilege. Eddard's hand was briefly warm against his cheek, then gone. They started north. The King's Road took them like a river taking twigs, and Winterfell fell behind them as if it had been retracted and stored in some deep trunk. Jon did not look back as often as he wanted to. He only permitted himself a last long glance when a turn in the road hid it behind pine. He saw the towers lift like the fingers of a man who has something to say and thought of the crypts under them and the stone women and the men with swords made of memory. He thought of a letter in his cloak and a parcel sewn inside it and a ring narrow as a promise that had outlived the woman who wore it. He thought of a king with laughter like a blow. He thought of a queen with hair like a breach of sunlight. He thought of a dwarf whose words had made him feel less alone in the cold. He did not think of rubies. He did not want to think of the river where a man had gone down with his jewels and never found the heir. He thought of ice. Ghost ran ahead and back and ahead again in ecstatic sweeps, coming to the edge of the trees and turning as if to count them, as if that were a task that could be completed. The boys near Yoren whispered and jostled and tried to be cruel in small ways to prove they would not break when bigger cruelty came. Yoren let them do it until he had had enough and then whacked one gently on the head with the flat of his hand and they settled again. Benjen sang, under his breath, a song with no words to it and a rhythm that belonged to boot soles and patience. The air smelled of iron and pine and a little of the distant sea as the wind found them through some trick of valleys. Jon rode and learned the stable steadiness of his own body again, the way a man shapes himself to his horse and his horse shapes itself to the man. He felt the road's insistence, its sense of purpose that is different from a man's. Roads go on because they are roads, not because they have decided to. He thought he would be a different size at the end of this one. He thought he might fit rooms differently. He might learn how much of himself he needed in a room to feel whole. He pushed his hand into his cloak and closed it around the seam where the parcel lay, not to check whether it was there. He would always know it was there, but to feel the fact of it. It felt like a story with only the beginning told and all the middle and all the ending still shapeless, bright, waiting to be ruined or made. Around the second bend the trees opened a little and gave them a clear view of the sky. It was the kind of blue men write poems about when they are done with a day's work and feel full. It did not care about poems. It spread itself and ignored them. Jon tipped his head back to look at it as if he might drink. He did not pray. He did not know yet how to pray to a truth that had made him and nearly unmade him in a morning. He made a small sound in his throat that might become a prayer someday when it had more bones. He pressed his knees to his horse and the horse took the cue and increased his pace a little, as if a boy's thoughts were a merciful spur. Yoren fell back beside him after a while. He had a smell like damp leather and the inside of a sack and a faint sweetness that might have been the shadow of pipe smoke in his clothes. "You ride neat," Yoren said without preamble, as if he were folding one of Jon's shirts with his words. "You sit straighter than you think you do. The wall likes neat riding. It tells a man he might be counted on to carry something fragile and not drop it. There'll be men up there who think you soft for riding so. Let them. Soft and good are cousins. Hard and brittle are closer than a man thinks when he's young." "I'll remember," Jon said. He wanted words for this man like he wanted warm stew after a day in the cold. "How long have you been carrying boys to the wall?" "Since I lost a bet in Old Town," Yoren said. "Since the winter before a winter before that one. Since men stopped wanting to go and needed to be told. Men who choose it are rarer now and finer when they do. You look like a choice. Don't make me wrong." "I won't," Jon said, and meant to make it true. They made camp when the light had leached from the road and taken the color from their hands. The fire Benjen and Yoren built had a cautious ambition. It knew not to roar while two men who wished to remain small slept under its light. Ghost curled against Jon's legs and put his back to the cold and looked at him with one eye and then the other, as if he could not decide which way Jon would look best and wanted to be ready. Benjen told them a story about a man who had believed a woman when she told him she could make him love her and had been wrong. Yoren told them a story about a time when a boy had been asked to sit and had stood instead and had learned something useful. John stared into the fire until the flames turned to a braided coil in his sight, and then to something else, like a very bright rope thrown from a very small boat into a very deep darkness. He did not sleep quickly. He lay on his side and watched Benjen's breath and Yoren's. He heard the boys' little animal noises and the men's practiced hushes. He felt the ring through his cloak, the twist of hair like a small living thing carried close to the heart of a different living thing where it could be warmed. He thought of his father's hand on his shoulder, heavy and certain, and of how certainty can be a mercy when the ground moves. He thought of a king who had laughed in his father's face and slapped his arm, of a queen who had watched all day and probably slept like a cat, one eye open. He thought of a dwarf whose advice about bending knees had been more useful than most men's prayers. He thought of a tower and a woman and a bowl of cold water and the smell of petals crushed and refusing to apologize for their scent. When sleep came, it came like snow falling on snow that had already fallen, quietly layering the world without changing it much until morning, when you wake to find the world made new, not because the flakes were more beautiful than the ones before, but because they compounded themselves minute insistences light upon light until the very door you had walked through all your life had a different weight when you opened it. He would go north and become something and unbecome something and find the pieces changed. He would be the same height and not. He would begin to learn the cost of names and the price of keeping them. He would write his first letter in the cold and not send it. He would stand on the wall and stare at a sky which did not often show its heart and sometimes gave it all away in a single clean night that made men's chests hurt. For now he slept, with ghosts slow breathing like a bellows at his calves and a kind of warmth he had not expected rising from the earth itself through his blanket. As if the old stones and old soil had decided to pity a boy who had learned too much in one morning and given him a small loan of heat. When he woke before dawn, the fire was an orange eye in a gray face. Benjen sat with his cloak around his shoulders and the look of a man who had been thinking too long and had told himself to stop and been ignored by his thoughts. He smiled at John, his winter smile that showed the least bit of teeth as if to imply he had more if necessary. "Up," he said. "A day seems longer if you catch it at the throat." He tossed him a piece of bread hard enough to chip a tooth and the last of the stew that had survived sleeping, and John ate and felt each mouthful go down like a stone that was somehow useful inside him. They put their boots on when the frost still had a dealer's sheen across the ground and the horse's breath came out in plumes like the ghosts of ships. They mounted and turned their faces to the north. The King's Road, which had been a companion who knew some jokes yesterday, was a stern old soldier today and refused to let them dawdle. They fell into the road's rhythm without complaint. John pressed his hand against his cloak once, for courage and for the particular joy of knowing that small secret weight was still there, and then he put his hand on the reins and kept it there. The morning bit. The sun showed itself slowly and refused to hurry for them, like all honest sons. Yoren coughed once and spat and hummed a song to himself that had more weather than words in it. Benjen told them where they would reach by midday if they moved, and where if they slowed, and no one suggested slowing. Ghost loped ahead and made his white mark on the new day. He would do it tomorrow and the day after if given the chance. John smiled, the first unthought smile since the gods would, small. A private thing he kept in his mouth to warm it. He would not be warm often. It was good to know warmth was possible and would come without being begged for sometimes if you kept moving. Behind them, Winterfell stones kept their own counsel and the halls filled again with the clatter and softness of life. The high voices of girls and the lower ones of men, the scratching of rats in prosperous walls, the language of boots and spoons. Eddard Stark would put one more coat on his caution and stand in the hall when the king called for him, and say words men would remember and some would not. A queen would take her measure and make her sums. A boy would climb. The gods would count leaves. The heart tree would not be surprised at anything. It had seen everything and liked almost nothing and loved enough to keep the light on in winter. And John rode, with a truth under his ribs that would not let him sleep as easily as he once had and would keep him standing when he might otherwise fall. He did not know yet how it would change the measure of his strides. He only knew this. He had a direction and a hard road, a white wolf, a packet of letters, and a ring that was plain and narrow and would, someday, cut like a hoop of cold around a finger already numb. He had his father's love set down, finally, in words that had been raw and unstoried. He had his mother's hair bound with blue. The wind found him and made his eyes water, and he let it, and did not pretend to himself that the tears were not partly the wind and partly something else. He did not look back again. He had used his last look at the right place and time. He kept his face north and his hands easy on the reins, and the road carried him like a long phrase that would take a while to complete, and he did not resist the grammar of it. It was enough for now to ride under a sky that had room for him, and to know that when he offered his breath to the cold it took it and made no scorn. It was enough to say his name in his head and let it echo against another name that would stay there, unspoken, and be both weight and wing in the same heartbeat. It was enough to measure the world by hoofbeats and to understand that in such measuring a boy can become a man without noticing exactly when the measurement changed units. It was enough for now to go. The second day's frost made a lace along the ditch beside the King's Road, delicate and false. The lightest boot broke it, and water glimmered underneath like a secret revealed in a clumsy hand. John rode beside Ben-Jen, and the horses' breaths twined and combed themselves away in the air. In the early hours all sound was clean-edged. A crow's call carried farther than it should have. When a strap creaked it sounded momentarily like a complaint. He found that if he matched his breath to the horse's breathing the morning steadied inside him, and when his thoughts began to race he pressed his knees and felt the good animal give him something immediate to attend to. A small request answered at once by a shift of weight and a flick of ear. Ghost came and went along the verge with a dancer's concentration, stopping only to press his nose to old hoofprints or to stare into trees with a stillness that made the hair rise on John's forearms. By midday the pins and needles cold eased out of the light, and the smell of horse and leather and the wax Ben-Jen used on the reins became the world. The boys Yoren had fetched strung behind them like an uneven necklace. One sang under his breath in a voice too tuneful for his age, as if a broader life had been coming for him and missed. Another stared all the while at the back of Yoren's head with a look that made John want to throw a cloak around the man, though the day was warmer. It is a terrible thing to be the object of another's need when you are already cold. Yoren, who had the sense of men behind him the way a man has the sense of rain coming on his shoulders, looked back once and nodded at the boy and said nothing. The boy looked away as if his eyes had not meant to be caught and had to be punished for it. They made a meal where the King's Road left off cutting a line of stones and fell briefly into a natural hollow, out of the wind. Ben-Jen produced a wedge of cheese and a handful of shriveled apples that had the texture of leather and the taste of summer if you shut your eyes. Yoren had a flask of something he pretended was only to keep the cold from his teeth. He passed it, and the boys made faces of men tasting iron. John took a sip and felt it go down like a small bright animal, alive and indignant, that lodged temporarily between his ribs and complained. He ate bread that had become hard at the edges where cold had licked it and thought, as he always did about the first person who had decided to bake dough for days. About the patience of that first attempt and the doubt, and the pride when it worked, and how quickly such pride curdled into a habit men could no longer imagine praising. He kept touching the seam inside his cloak when no one watched, an idle, anxious reassurance, as if the weight might have gone away while he was busy with his hands. He did not open the leather packet his father had given him. He could feel the letters as plainly as if he had memorized their names by the outline alone. He did not have to guess that one of them would bear a rush-worked seal he had seen in childhood only once, when a small boat from the neck had come up to a Winterfell ford with 3 thin men inside and a fish that had died on the way and still looked surprised. Howland Reed had a way of looking at a room that made it seem as if he had counted not the people in it but the places where they weren't. John thought of the man now and felt nearer to a door in a wall that most days had only the suggestion of a hinge. Toward evening the sky took on a green patience at the western edge, and the trees' shadows stretched out long and thin as if yearning would let them reach the road. The boys' talk quickened at the promise of stopping, the way the body remembers softness and tells the tongue to run ahead to it. They quartered their horses in a half-collapsed stable that smelled of old straw and fox and whispered about whether the fox would sniff their noses while they slept. Yoren swore mildly and showed them how to put their saddles where they would not be stolen by men or eaten by mice. Ben-Jen pulled a splinter from his palm with his teeth and flicked it away with the same economy he gave to speech. That night the fire made a little dome of warmth like an idea men could agree on and sit near. John sat with his back to a stump, and the smoke found him as smoke always finds the person least interested in conversation. Joran told a tale that was more an inventory of names than a story, and the boys let the names lodge in them, because names are the first food a new thing eats. If you remember what your fellows are called, you can pretend the world intends to keep you among them. Benjen said nothing. He watched the fire as if he might see inside it the next day's weather and the shape of the snowfields. When John looked at him in that long stillness, he saw the wall rise already in Benjen's gaze, as if a man wears the place he is going the moment he decides to go. Sleep came late, and when it came it put him in a room not of his choosing. He dreamt he stood in a narrow hall with a roof that sloped too steeply, so that the weight of the sky seemed pressing above him. He carried in his hands a basin with a rippling skin on it that men call blood or water depending on their fear. He set it down on a low stool and turned, and the room turned with him, and he thought he saw a woman's face as one sees a face in a mirror that has no been polished clean, and damnation and forgiveness were both there, neither ready to speak. He woke with that feeling at his throat like the cold's own hand. On the third morning the trees thinned and the land opened, and the light fell farther before it was stopped, and John felt exposed and freer both. The King's Road drew a straight line across a country that preferred curves and inner places. He saw abandoned fields with fences mended in the manner of men who had promised themselves to tend them after a winter and then had not returned to keep their promise. The gift lay ahead of them, those old wet acres granted to the Night's Watch when men still thought rightly of paying for their guardians and not only of making use of them. Far holdfasts crouched like toads. A child in a doorway turned his head and stared at the riders with the slow, grave hardiness of one who knew his mother would have words if he reached to touch anyone's cloak. At midday they passed a croft where a woman with a baby at her breast stood in the doorway and watched them without curiosity. She had the face of a place that endures. The lines were not age so much as accumulation, the way a map acquires notes at the edges. Joran raised his hand with an ease that said he has raised his hand in greeting in 100 such places and been greeted 100 different ways. The woman lifted 2 fingers, not so much to him as to some shape of him that had ridden past other women on other days and had been part of a man's story when she had no hand on it. Ghost trotted past and the baby turned its head and then turned back at once to feed. They stopped at Molestown the evening of the 4th day, the little warren that clung to the earth as if afraid of the sky, with more of itself below ground than above. Men say the Night's Watch owns a piece of it and that the rest of it owns the watch. The smell of damp earth and spilt beer and bodies came up the holes where men had put doors, like a creature that had its own opinion about what a town should be. Joran led them with an experienced contempt to a place where they would not be cheated more than necessary. The boys looked at the steps that led down as if they led into a story they had heard at hearths and wanted to find out whether it had the same teeth in the mouth as in the telling. Benjen let them look and said nothing until Rast began to swagger toward the hole with an expression that did not suit him. Then he put a hand on the boy's shoulder and the whole of Rast's future retirement in one large gesture. "Tomorrow," Benjen said, as if he were granting a boon. "If you still want it tomorrow, pick that penny up, you dropped it in your dreaming." John sat with a mug that had been full of something once and now had the smell of it and watched a girl move between tables with the flat-footed grace of women who have learned to keep their faces still when their bodies are watched for purchase. She was not older than him by much and probably younger. Her hair had been combed until it had gloss and then left, the way you make a thing respectable when you cannot make it new. She glanced at John and then looked away from his wolf with a deliberate unconcern. Ghost lay under the bench with only his tail visible, a white curve that suggested snow rolling off a branch in a very precise way. The girl set a dish in front of Joran and another before Benjen. Benjen ate as if the food had done him no harm yet and might not. Joran ate like a man who has learned to get his share even in places where he is disliked for it. John ate and watched the way the place breathed and exhaled, the way men shifted to make room for a new arrival as if part of them was always measuring their size, adjusting their edges. His eyes kept going to the passage mouth at the far end every time the draft changed. He did not know what he expected to come through it, and that is the way fear introduces itself when it does not want to say its name. There were girls who sat on men's laps and girls whose eyes went to the floor when men put coin on the table, because if they looked up too quickly at the coin or at the man, someone or the other would take offense. There were men whose hands trembled because they had waited too long, and men whose hands were too steady to be safe. There were a few brothers of the watch with faces like old shutters, splintered and useful. There were the little deceits of trade and the larger ones, and the old woman in the corner who had chosen to pretend to sleep so that she could listen and perhaps sell what she heard in the morning to someone who wanted to buy a story to have something to do with their hands in the cold. John drank slowly because Joran had told him once in passing that if you drink slowly, the world has fewer sharp corners for the next hour, and the next hour is the only one any man is guaranteed. He slept in a room with 7 other bodies and a dark that was nearly kind. He dreamed again, but the dream was only a horse tossing its head and a hand put out to steady it. And when he woke, the memory of the hand's feel stayed in him like the warmth a man leaves in a chair when he gets up. They saw the wall the next day just after noon. It did not so much appear as impose itself, as if the road, tired of being a road, decided at last to show the purpose for which it had gone so straight so long. It rose before them like a new horizon, and every man of them sat up a little, even those who had seen it often, as boys crane their necks when somebody important rides by and pretend they are not craning. John had thought himself prepared, because men sigh when they speak of it, and that sigh is its own kind of measuring. He had measured poorly. It was as if the world had taken up an idea about cold and height and then spent itself achieving that idea, and afterward had nothing left for sentiment. It was blue and white and old, and it made his throat work once without a word coming. Ghost stopped dead ahead of him and put his front paws apart and stared as if a ridgeback had raised itself on his spine. And then he sneezed and trotted on as if to suggest he was not impressed, though he was. Castle Black lay huddled at the wall's foot like a dog at a master's knee that has never yet been kicked and never been petted properly either. The towers were unlovely, and the yard was old and scabbed and clean in the way that comes from use. Men moved through it with the concentration of those who know the day's work is real and the play is, if anything, more dangerous. John smelled old wood, cooked fat, horse, leather, black wool that has known snow, tar, and the clean, high odor that comes off ice when the wind lays a hand on it. Benjamin's face shifted at the smell the way a man's face shifts when he first turns back to a well-known room after a long absence, and, before his eyes confirm anything, his nose tells him a story that may be pleasant or rotten. The first man to greet them was the sort of man you put at a gate when you want the gate to be taken seriously but you don't want to frighten away those already half frightened. "Ben Stark," he said, and the cordiality did not change his caution. He tipped his head at Joran. "You've brought us singers. I've brought you boys who can carry a tune when you give them one," Joran said, and the man snorted and shifted his chaw from one side to the other. He looked at John the way he looked at the other boys. Counting bones, estimating pride, allotting burdens. There was no malice in it. There was absence of deference, which is a tonic some boys find bitter and some find sweet. John found he could drink it. Donal Noy came up from the smithy soon after. He had one arm and a presence that made a second arm seem redundant. He ran his eyes over the horses and the boys and the men and made a sound in his throat that might have welcomed or scolded or merely judged and left judgment undelivered. "Robert was copper once, iron later, and now is pewter," he said to Benjen, as if they had been discussing the king in the middle of another conversation. "He carries well. He dents." He looked at John and at Ghost and at the leather of John's reins, and something in his eyes softened incrementally. "We'll find you boots that don't make the wall laugh," he said, and turned back toward heat. Inside the hall the fire leaped in a disciplined way, as if it had been told that warmth here is rationed like discipline, and it must not spend itself too soon. The stew was thick and nearly flavorless and therefore comforting, as blankets are comforting, not because they are beautiful but because they promise to do the job. John ate standing because there were not enough benches and because standing made him feel more present in his bones. The black brothers who passed had faces that read as simply as the grain in old wood and as complicated. One looked once at John and then once at Ghost, and the second look had something like pity in it that John wanted to refuse and could not. After the meal Benjen put a hand on John's shoulder and turned him toward a stair. "Come see the height," he said, and John followed. his heart tripping lightly like a colt in a yard that has not yet learned the limits of its legs. The elevator cage took them with a jolt like a large hand making a joke of your weight. The old wooden frame groaned, as if remembering every body it had ever lifted and announcing that it would not forget. The cold came in at them in increasing bites, sharp enough to make a man swear and then grateful enough to make him hold his breath so he could hear the ice sing. When they stepped onto the top, the light seemed changed, not simply brighter but more articulate. It told more of itself without being asked. The world to the south lay spread in the old, familiar journalist's flatness, pieces of countryside lined up for inspection. The world to the north stood up. It rose in ridges and shadows and the suggestion of greater ridges behind those, and where you thought to see dark you saw only a slow green that took the light reluctantly. John held the ice's edge in his hands and felt cold go into his palms like instruction. Ghost stood at once at the very lip, his body absolutely still and his head lifted, the lamplight pale of his hide becoming a thing of the sky. Ben-Jen watched them both with an expression that was not laughter and not fear and was part of both. A man seeing a boy meet the height and wanting to give him his own silence in which to do it. "I thought it would feel like falling upward," John said, because he had not meant to say anything and something had to be said to justify that. "It does," Ben-Jen said lightly. "On bad days." He drew in a breath and let it out, and vapor made a veil no human hand could weave. "You'll stand up here on nights when the snow comes like ash and the wind tries to take your jaw off, and you'll swear you can hear the timber of the wall settle in a way no man below can. You'll think it speaks. It does. It says, 'Do not let go.'" John looked at the north until his eyes watered and then until they stopped watering. He let the cold eat his face until his skin felt an inch too big for him. He thought of the parcel sewn inside his cloak, and of a ring he might one day put on his hand or never put on and be haunted by both omissions. He thought, unbidden, of a man with milk-bellied rubies on his breast floating down into water that had decided it would keep him, and of the small, insufficient consolation of how jewels sometimes surface when bodies do not. They came down and the day did what days do. It moved without asking permission and collected itself at the hour when the work no longer defended itself and had to be called off for the sake of the men. John was shown a pallet and told to keep his boots under it with the soles facing out so he could find them in the dark with his toes without turning them. It was the kind of instructor action that had been invented by a man late to a fire with one boot on backward, and John was grateful to whoever had made that mistake. He placed his few things with care and touched the seam again, once, before sleep. He dreamed of the wall's surface at arm's length, its trapped bubbles and the way light moves strangely through such thickness, as if even light had to remember itself when a man asked it to pass through something this old. Morning brought him to the yard under a sky that remembered snow but had not yet chosen to give it. Alistair Thorne moved through the ragged line of recruits with an expression he likely had worn since the first disappointment he had nursed into a style. His mouth was of the sort that would have found a way to sneer at a wedding. John felt his gaze skate over him and register something to be used later like a coin put aside for a small spite. The first blows with blunted swords always sound larger than their effect. Pride fills the spaces where strength is not yet ready. John held his practice blade as he had been taught in Winterfell's yard under Roderick Castle's bald and kindness-stern lectures, and killed no one and killed 3 in quick succession if you asked PYP after. And Alistair Thorne made a noise like a man who has stepped in slop that does not wash from a boot. He saw the other boys too, with the careful look he had learned this last year from standing at the edge of rooms. Gren with his shoulders too eager and a good nature that would break under the right hammer and become a better nature. Rast with a mouth like a scrape that never heals. Halder with hands that wanted wood more than iron. He saw PYP's eyes bright and fast, and noted the way he kept glancing toward the wall top as if something would come over it if he did not check. He tried not to make of himself the person the others would resent precisely because he could do what they could not yet. He found himself stepping forward twice to deflect a blow that would have broken a boy's nose and cost him the next day's sight. After, men called it arrogance because they liked the taste of that word better than the taste of help. He kept his mouth closed when Thorne said, with feigned patience, that if Lord Snow knew so much he could show them how to hold a sword as if it were not a loaf of bread. And John did, and held himself colder than his skin so he would not show that they had struck flesh with a remark men made cheap. Donal Noy found him afterward with a hammer handle over his shoulder that looked more like a staff than a tool. "You can fight," he said. "Do not let that convince you that you know anything a man needs in his bones to stay alive. You know the likes of your Lord Father and his master-at-arms taught you. That's not nothing. It is not enough. There are men up here who never held a sword until the day they learned to sleep in black. If you can teach, you'll have fewer men to bury. Pride's a poor pillow." "I don't mean to lord it," John said, and the smith's look told him his words had been the wrong ones even as he spoke them. "You are a lord whether you mean it or not," Donal said. "You wrap it around you the way a man wears his warmth. That's why your teeth aren't chattering the way the rest of their teeth are. Choose when to take it off. Choose how far to let it cover you, or let it wear you, and see how far that gets you when the wind's mean." John nodded and thought of his father's hand on his shoulder, and of Howland Reed, and of a ring that felt warmer against his skin than some men's kindness. "I'll try," he said. "Try quieter," said Donal Noy, and went away laughing soundlessly. Tyrion Lannister arrived at Castle Black a day later, his little horse blowing out indignation and the man himself bright with some private amusement. He stood in the yard and watched the recruits with an expression that did not spare him even from his own private jokes. When Jon saw him, a bleached corner of the cold in him eased. Tyrion saw him at once and tipped an imaginary hat and later found him at the top of the wall, as if they had agreed through the air alone to meet where the view would force them both to admit the world. "You took my advice," Tyrion said, coming up to the edge without hesitation and leaning his small hands on the ice as if he meant to press it into some shape that would suit him better. "You came to the place where men come to become something or nothing. Do you feel fewer or more letters in your name this morning?" "Some are heavier," Jon said. "They always are when you have to carry them uphill," Tyrion said. He peered into Jon's face and then at the line of his cloak and then out again at the north, as if the way a man held his shoulders could teach him the weather. "You look like a man with a secret he wishes to tame by starving it. Secret beasts do not starve if you keep them in your cloak. They come out fatter and angrier.
Videos bread occasionally.
It will like you better, or it will like you less. The important thing is to know how much it weighs on any given day, so you do not misjudge the way your feet must lift." "You sound like a maester," Jon said. He had not meant the words to be kind, but they were in his mouth. "I sound like a man who reads at night because his back hurts and he has fewer gods than he wants," Tyrion said. "Tell me something true." Jon had taken an oath to a tree to be careful. The dwarf did not have the knife smile his father had warned him of, but he had a knife mind, and perhaps that was worse, because it would always cut in silence. Jon looked north and said after a moment, "I thought I would feel cleansed. I do not. I feel more like a man who has learned a room has a second door and doesn't yet know whether to keep it shut or run through it." "A good start," Tyrion said. He rocked on his heels and looked down. "Do you want to know a thing? No? Good. I'll tell you anyway. The men down there are measuring you why. Th2 sticks. One is the stick that says you are better at this than they are, and that they will hate you for it unless you give them something to make up for feeling small beside you. The other is the stick that says you are a bastard and bastards owe everybody a drink. Take the first stick away by teaching them to hold it themselves. Break the second over someone's head when he presumes to use it against you too often. Moderation is dull and very useful. Shall I put that in a song?" Jon asked, surprised at his own dryness, and Tyrion looked at him sideways, pleased. "Put it in your gloves," he said. "You'll need it for the morning." He turned his head and stared at the north for a long breath. He sobered without warning. "And if you see eyes in the trees that should not be there," he added very quietly, "come down. Do not stare back too long. Men who stare into the same dark all their lives start to see their own eyes looking back, and that is when they fall." Jon did not ask what he had seen or whether such advice had come from reading or from walking too far before dawn. He let the words set and put his palm to the ice again and took from it not comfort but steadiness. He wrote his first letter that night and did not send it. He set the charcoal down 3 times and picked it up 4 He wrote, "Father," and then realized that the word itself caused a rattle somewhere inside he had not accounted for. As a drawer that had always held spoons reveals a hidden compartment one night and you have to decide whether to use it. He wrote, "I have come safe to the wall," and then wrote beneath that, "The cold here is like another man in the room who has no reason to dislike you and does anyway," and then rubbed that out and put instead a list of names of boys in the yard with brief notes, Gren Tall Kind, PYP Quick Talk, Ras Sour, and then wrote, "I dreamed of water again." He set the page aside to sand, and the letters in the leather packet under the seam of his cloak felt heavier by comparison, as if they had watched him write and taken on some of the weight he had refused to give his own lines. He folded the page and tucked it beneath the rough pillow. His sleep came in fits and starts, like a horse in a strange stall, startled by its own flanks. Days arranged themselves into a discipline that felt in his body like the structure of a song he would never sing aloud. Before dawn, the bite of water in a basin, the habit of breath clouding and receding, the first exchange of curses as men found their boots where they had not been inside, the yard in gray light, the sting of blunted iron, the sore palm that would not toughen as quickly as pride had promised. Thorne's voice sang the same things and new cruelties, both inventive and dull. John swallowed more words than he said. He learned how far to bend to help someone without it being seen to be help, and how far to let a boy's pride bruise itself before stepping in. Gren began to step where John would have stepped. PYP began to watch John's eyes and smile just before the blow came, as if he had become able to borrow John's timing. Halder laughed once at one of Thorne's jokes, not because the joke deserved it, but because Halder had learned to laugh and choose to let it be expensive sometimes and sometimes cheap. The evenings stretched and then contracted like a muscle learning what it can do. Donald Noy told him about metals without turning it into a sermon. "Some men are copper," he said, working his bellows with his thighs as if pumping a heartbeat into iron. "They take a shine quick and dull twice as quick. Some are iron." He glanced meaningfully at John's practice blade, which looked straight and honest and ordinary. "If they're not tempered right, they break when they ought to bend. Some are good steel if they're cared for. Most are something else. You cannot make a sword of every man, and you shouldn't try. I've seen boys like you." He lifted his chin toward the yard, not John, and in that gesture included him, "who think they owe the world a hero. The world prefers a steady hand." "I will try not to go looking for songs at the bottom of a well," John said. "If you fall down a well, shout," Donald returned. "We'll send PYP. He'll joke you back to the surface or annoy the stones into spitting you out." Ben-Jen sometimes came out to watch the training and said nothing, and then said one thing and went away. Like a winter that hides its best days, so men do not grow careless. He spent more time than was fair in the maps room with a man whose hands shook and whose eyes did not. John watched them together once from the doorway and saw in their bodies a language he did not yet speak. Whole sentences about ravines and old roads and the way ice can look like water under poor light. When he could, he took his dinner with Ben-Jen in a corner where the other men had made a little casual emptiness for a man who had been their brother's brother for so long that they forgot to call him anything else. They talked small because small holds. Ben-Jen told him how to warm his hands inside his elbows when the wind made his fingers refuse to obey him. John told him about Arya's gift of the needle and the way she had looked at him, wanting to bite the air. Ben-Jen's face changed in a small way that made John think of a younger, rougher man inside the one he saw. "She will wear wolf and rose both," Ben-Jen said softly. "She will terrify men who deserve it." Tyrion left and promised himself other conditions and other jokes. Before he went, he put a hand on John's forearm and squeezed it with a cordial solemnness. "My last advice," he said, "make enemies slowly. They last longer and they lie truer. And if you find yourself needing to tell someone the truth, pick a poor listener. Your words will be safer between his ears where they will be misunderstood." "You have too many words," John said. He surprised himself by adding, "Keep them. They keep you." "They do," Tyrion essayed. ID, and bowed elaborately to Ghost, who accepted the bow as his due and yawned. "And that's what I'll do with them. Men at the wall like to pretend they have no use for a gossip's pleasure. They have more use for it than most because they have fewer other kinds of food. The talk that came up through the rooms moved in tendrils and stopped at doorways and went sideways and returned. John learned which men grieved publicly only when drunk and which grieved sober and alone, which simply never grieved at all, not because they were strong but because nothing had attached to them hard enough to leave a scar when it tore away. He learned which night was best to walk the wall and not be stopped by those who would like to ask questions a boy should not have to answer. He learned that Maester Eamon's voice could make you forget your own height. It had a steadiness like a line drawn by candlelight that somehow did not waver, and when he spoke the words sat in the air with their own grave weight, unhurried and unembarrassed. The first time he went to Eamon it was for a practical thing. A recruit had cut his hand and would not admit it hurt and then could not hold a spoon, and John brought him to the maester because sometimes carrying a man to help is the only way to honor his pride. The room smelled of dried things, useful things, and a faint sweetness that did not belong to any herb John could name. The old man sat in his chair with a blanket that had been mended with a net of patient stitches. His eyes were filmed, but there was nothing film-like about his attention. "Here is a boy who has learned to keep the truth warm in his pocket," he said when the recruit had gone and John was about to. John's heart made that foolish jump when a hard thing is nearly touched and the body pretends it is not afraid of being recognized as its owner. "I brought him because it was foolish not to," he said, too quickly. "Sometimes we bring because we cannot bear to carry," the maester said gently. He lifted his hand and turned it slightly, listening to the motion of air over his palm. "You stand as if you think a piece of you might fall out if you move too much. Do not worry. The floor has seen worse." "I came to the wall to learn how not to spill," John said, surprising himself. "You will learn that the world wobbles and men wobble, and there is grace in wobbling," Eamon said. "There is a steadiness that is not hard. There is a being kept because you cannot keep yourself." His head tilted a fraction. "There is also choice. I have known some men to have that too." John thought of his father's face in the godswood and of the way he had said, "I love you," and how simple it had been then to stand upright beneath it. "Do I know you?" he asked, and when the question was out, it seemed to have been waiting the whole while in the rafters to drop on him. "You know me in the way men know each other who have not met," Maester Eamon said, and he did not smile. "You will know me differently if you wish. You might find I am a poor substitute for any truth you want and a good one for a truth you fear. That is a poor sort of guidance given by an old man. I am old enough to get away with poor guidance. Do I carry a name, you know?" John asked without daring to breathe deeply after. "You carry 3, Eamon said. "One is painted on your back so men can see it when you turn. One is stitched into your shirt, where only hands that mean to undress you will go. One is written on water and will not keep. The last is sometimes the kind that makes a man drown. If you wish to live, learn when to speak which." He lifted his hands and laid them on the table as if placing 2 stones there to mark the end of a road. John did not move for a moment. He bowed slightly without thinking it, a reflex to a kind of altar he had not named. Eamon's eyes drifted past him to a wall John could not see. "Go," the old man said. "Do not stare at me as if I am a book that will read you in return. It is disagreeable." He left with the unpleasant lightness a man feels when he has been told something true and is still free to pretend otherwise. The training grew more complex as the cold deepened. The men learned each other's faults and each other's offerings. PYP began to make a joke of John's way of standing with his weight slightly forward and his lips pressed when he was trying to remember a thing. "He is about to teach his own body how to hold a truth," PYP would say, and John would throw him a snowball with precisely the force to sting and not to bruise, and PYP would yelp and punch the air, pleased to have been seen and calibrated. Gren became good at being between another man and a blow, the same way trees between the wind and soft things are good. Halder made for himself a small marvel one night, a spoon with a handle carved like a fish with scales so fine that in poor light the spoon looks alive. He showed John as if showing him to test whether the thing indeed had been made or dreamed. John touched it and said, "You made the head too wise." And Halder grinned and said, "I couldn't help myself. Alistair Thorne's barbs did what barbs do when they strike the same place too often. They numbed before they bled." John held himself steady. Once, when Thorn called him Lord Snow in that sing-song that turned the title into a mockery. Jon said, in a voice as even as ice, "Sir," and did not look away. It was an impudence that was also obedience. Thorn's mouth thinned as if something sour had got between his teeth and stuck, and he moved on without drawing blood. Later Jon felt his hands shake, and he let them shake inside his gloves where no one would see. Pride is a thing to be obeyed and punished both. The knights on the wall were the sort that make men admit having a god, even if the admission never leaves their mouths. Sometimes the sky stayed heavy and the men on the top walked their watch under a blanket of cloud so low it made even tall men duck from Abbott. Sometimes the stars spilled out as if the sky were the overturned bottom of a bin of small, hard things. Once the lights came, green and pink and white, stitching themselves into the dark, a slow fire that did not warm the face and did something to the bones. The men stayed quieter when the lights came, even those who had words for everything. Ghost stood with hackles saying nothing and eyes wide. Jon put his palm on the wolf side and felt the heartbeat decide to be faster and then decide to slow itself deliberately the way a brave thing acts brave when watched. He had other dreams. In one he stood in Winterfell's Godswood and the heart tree's mouth moved, not to speak but to exhale endless white ribbons that wound around his wrists and would not burn away when he lifted them to the torch. In another he ran with a white body. He became the runner. He felt snow on his tongue that tasted not of water but of old coins and distant copper. In a third he became a smaller thing than either, a ring rolling and hair twisted around it to slow it. He woke each time with the sense that a place in him had been rearranged when he wasn't looking. The furniture of the soul shuffled to different corners. Benjen came to his pallet one morning before light with his hair still carrying the dark smell and touched Jon's shoulder. Jon came awake with the suddenness boys have when their sleep is honest. "I ride beyond the wall today," Benjen said, as if he were telling him he would borrow a spoon and be back by supper. He did not place drama in the sentence because too much life had taught him it would make the sentence ring false. "How long?" Jon asked. He kept his voice steady, because now was not the moment to make the room ring with his private metal. "As long as the woods let me," Benjen said. But then he half smiled and gave a more mortal answer. "A fortnight, if they are as kind as the maps pretend. A month, if the men I ride with need more sleep than I do." "You'll come back," Jon said. He did not make it a question and did not make it a command. He made it a map. Benjen laid a hand where Jon's neck met his shoulder and squeezed, and for a moment Jon tasted smoke. Not this fire, a remembered one, and he swallowed and kept his face level. "I'll come back," Benjen said in a tone that was simultaneously promise and factual placeholder. "And before I go I am going to say something I do not like saying because it sounds like a prayer and the gods do not care for prayers that sound practiced. You will keep your head down when a man wants to raise it with his flattery. You will sit down when a man wants to make you stand for the sake of his pride. You will laugh at PYP twice for every time you would strangle him. And you will speak to Maester Aemon when you do not know whether to shut your mouth or open it. He has a way of placing his finger on the correct hinge." Jon nodded. He wanted information, not comfort, and wanted comfort, not information, and neither thirst canceled the other. "Come back," he said again, "because men have been coaxed to come back by less." Benjen squeezed his nape once more and left. The sound of his boots going along the corridor had a meaning Jon would know later in his body and recognize in other bootfalls forever. At sunrise he watched the ranging ride out, their black a moving slice against the snow. Benjen did not look back, not because he had no one to look back to, but because men have to make certain kinds of severing with their eyes sometimes to make the ride possible. Jon threw himself into the day's work with more ferocity than grace. He struck until his arms shook, and PYP said afterward, "Well, someone has feelings," and Jon said, "Yes," and left it there, which made PYP, for once, have no ready answer and so laugh, alone and look after him, half worried and half fond. In the hall at dusk, the sound of spoons and men's voices had a hollowness, like a kind of temporary hunger. Jon ate and tasted very little, as men taste little the day they give up a habit and decide that the decision itself must be fed. That night he took his letter out and read the few lines he had written and put them away without adding more. He went up to the top of the wall and walked along its lip with Ghost, the rope of the safety line in his hand, not for fear but for ritual. Halfway down the eastern side, Maester Eamon stood with a brother who had his hand lightly on the old man's elbow, as if both to steady him and be steadied. They did not turn. The old man's face lifted to the north as if to catch a distant echo. Jon stopped within speaking distance and chose not to speak. He waited as long as it took to learn patience. After some time, Eamon's companion guided him toward the stair, and as they came near, the maester broke the silence but not the mood. "When you cannot see a man, you often see more of him," Eamon said to the knight as if it were a student. Jon did not know if it was to him. Sometimes they come up here to speak true, sometimes to practice speaking. Sometimes they listen hard and think that is speaking. That is the worst kind of liar, the one who believes his listening is speech. "I talk too little," Jon said before he could stop himself. "You talk enough," Eamon said without turning. "You forget to ask." He passed Jon with the careful grace of those who know each step as it should be and intend, with great pride, to make their feet obey the memory. The nights and days braided themselves together with that slow practicality men develop where the elements do not do them the courtesy of improvisation. Jon learned to be something quieter in the yard, and found that by wintering his voice, he created space for grens and pyps to rise. He saw in small increments the way a group thickens into something. It becomes less like a cluster of men and more like a swarm, and then more like a single animal with many heads that still remembers to put its feet in roughly tea. The same place. Alistair Thorne kept them honest with his special cruelty. They learned to take it like medicine and spit when his back turned. Donal Noy kept them fed and shod and suppressed foolishness with a humor that wrapped the scolding like a strip of bacon around something a boy would not otherwise eat. Word came of a storm that had buried a holdfast 2 days' ride away past the Weeping Ridge, and the news rolled through the castle like another kind of weather. Men who did not fear cold respected it, as carpenters respect the weight of wood when wet. A forager came in with frostbite on 3 toes and a story about shapes in the trees. He did not dramatize it. That made it worse. He said, "They were not eyes. They felt like eyes." And the room arranged itself subtly around the sentence, moving benches closer to the fire and falling into smaller knots for talk. On a morning when the sky could not decide whether to give snow or hold it, Yoren came into the yard to collect 3 who had changed their minds and would go south with him again at the end of a turn. Boys who had found their courage smaller than the wall's sound. Men who had cheated a rope and decided they would be better off with a road they could leave when a hedge appeared. He had a way of looking at a deserter that did not condemn and did not forgive. As a man looks at a puddle he refuses to step in because he knows where the road goes after. He saw Jon and nodded, and Jon came over because to deny a nod given by a man who had watched you sleep face to the door would be a kind of meanness he could not afford. "You've not softened," Yoren said, as if inquiring after a joint. He looked him up and down as if measuring a horse he might not purchase because he had too many mouths already and this one looked ready to eat. "I've hardened badly," Jon said. "Noy says I should bend more and crack less." "Noy knows what breaks," Yoren said. He lifted his hat and scratched his scalp and then settled the hat again. "You look like you could leave something behind and not miss it yet." "I have left something behind," Jon said. He did not specify a man with black hair riding out under a sky that had not yet decided whether to snow. Yoren's eyes flicked to the north and then to Jon's mouth and he nodded again, as if a bargain had been offered to the heir and accepted. "If I see you again, I'll bring you some lies to make you feel better," Yoren said. "I'm good at them. You'll like mine." "If you see Arya," Jon said suddenly, and that name cut him in a place he had been covering with cloth. "If you see my sister in the south, tell her to keep moving. Tell her standing still is for men who like the feel of their own boots too much." "I'll tell her," Yoren said. He had a look then that suggested he had looked too long at the world and was trying to be kinder to it for that very reason. "I'll tell myself." Jon watched him go with the 3 men behind him, and the way the men's shoulders sloped told him that one at least would turn back within a mile and another would keep going and one would get lost for a day and then find the road, and none of them would write a song about it for their grandchildren. That night the wind took on the quality of talk John remembered from certain Winterfell evenings when the men came in drunk and tried to speak under their breath, because the lady slept and the little ones slept, and the old ones might be dead but would wake to hear a good story. The wind had secrets it wanted to get rid of. It prowled around the edges of his palate and found the seam in his cloak with exquisite cruelty, as small annoyances always find the precise place to needle. He dreamed nothing, which was a relief and a loss. A week after Benjen left, a raven came in with its beak full of what Donal Noy called the usual nonsense, and everyone else called news. The bird bit a brother's knuckle and left a bead of blood there that the man put to his mouth with a little boy's indignation, and someone said, "It likes you," and the man said, "It can like my arse," and the hall laughed in the exhausted way men do who are glad the moment has not arrived when laughter fails. The letter was from a small lordling near Queenscrown who had seen something across the lake and did not like it but had no intention of doing more than saying so. Bowen Marsh read it out with the same assumption that men at tables would do what tables were for, which is continue to eat while news was read. John tried to catch the sense of the thing through the steam rising from his bowl. Thorne made a face that said some men would see ghosts and call them gods to get out of pulling their own cart. Marsh said a word about doubling watches and the room shifted, not interested in fear but interested in the adjustments fear makes you perform with your body. John felt Ghost press his head against John's knee under the table and keep it there with stubbornness. He put his hand down and kept it there, staying the wolf and himself. He found himself in Maester Eamon's room the next day with no errand to justify the visit. The old man was wrapping a bandage around a man's forearm in a slow, secure self-conversation. His fingers moved with the memory of 1,000 such wrappings. The man belonging to the arm watched like a boy on his best behavior. John waited until the maester had murmured whatever he murmured to tell the man the thing was done, and when they were alone Eamon surprised him by not seeming surprised. "I do not like to be asked for counsel," he said gently. "It suggests I am a tower to be climbed to look for wind. Wind is not what men need. They need a hand on the shoulder. You stand too straight for that. It makes me cranky." "I can bend," John said, and Eamon said, "I do not ask boys to bend for my comfort." And then, "Tell me something you cannot say to anyone with young eyes." The invitation was too carefully shaped not to be abused. John took a breath as if he were about to plunge into cold water and lean into the cold rather than trick himself into liking it. "If a man has been told to hold a truth like a coal," he said slowly, "how does he know when to show it to a man who cannot be burned by it?" "Ah," Eamon said, "he does not. He only knows when he has burned himself too much to keep the coal whole. He risks it because the other choice is to be branded all his life by a secret that does not love him." He turned his face toward John in that blind habit that was more accurate than most men's stares. If, hypothetically, a boy carried a secret that was older than his own bones, and if, hypothetically, an old man had once been close to the furnace that forged that secret, the boy might think he could open his hand here without losing the skin of it. He might be right. He might be wrong. The only thing we can say with certainty is that the old man should be careful not to mistake his memory for heat. John closed his eyes against a prick of wet. He had not wanted a door to swing so easily, and he had wanted it. He set his lips and said nothing. The only sound was Ghost's breath from the threshold and the soft complaint of the wall in the wind. "Do not tell me a thing because I would like to know it," Eamon said, and the effort in the old voice made the room warmer. "Tell me a thing because it cannot be borne otherwise. I have been loved by secrets as men are loved by beasts that lie at their feet and die when they leave the room. I have lost names and let names go. I am not a safe harbor. I am a harbor that carries a man into the same ocean where he intended to drown, and then finds him a piece of wood to cling to. That is the most I can be." "That is much," John managed. He opened his eyes and let the room be what it was. Small, purposeful, full of dried leaves whose names he did not know. "I am not ready." "Of course not," Eamon said, as if John had declared he had not learned to fly. "That is why men carry until their arms are stronger or the coal cooler. Come again later, or don't. I will be here, doing the small work that saves a finger and loses an arm and must be borne for being only able to do the small." John went out with the sense of having not gone in at all. He stood in the corridor with his back against the cool stone and let it take him like heat does, into itself and back out again. He wanted his father for a moment with an intensity that embarrassed him and reminded him that boys are always boys in the presence of someone who told them once a true thing and has continued to be alive when others did not. He imagined his father in a hall he did not know, handling a king's wild laughter like a disputed blade, and he set his jaw in sympathy, which is a small courage most men never credit themselves for. The first snow that stayed came 3 days later. It fell all day with that quiet ferocity snow possesses when it has come prepared to labor and will not be distracted. The yard's rhythm changed a little to suit it, as bodies changed to accommodate the presence of an uninvited guest with impeccable manners. PYP put his head back and tried to catch flakes on his tongue until Thorne told him that his tongue was the most use it had ever been, and PYP, to his credit, only smiled and shut his mouth and continued to catch them, eyes narrowed. Gren stood with his palms up and watched the flakes die there, thoughtful as an old man. John swung his practiced sword until the joints of his shoulders behaved again, and then asked Halder to make him a grip that would not punish him for wearing stiff gloves. Halder held John's hand and the hilt with equal care and nodded, the way a man nods when given a thing he will make better. Letter from the south came at a pace that left men feeling they had been made to read a book while running. A small, sickly yellow without news of the sort men wanted. The king had hunted badly and then well and then poorly. The queen had smiled and not smiled. A mention of the hand without name but with weight enough to make the room shift subtly again. John learned to listen and not listen, the way men sometimes pay attention to a song while polishing a blade and know only its rhythm and still it gives them something they take into their hands later, without knowing from where they have acquired it. He dreamed less for a week and then more for 3 nights in a row, the kind of dreams that leave you panting and ashamed and grateful without knowing to which of these feelings you owe what. Benjen did not return yet. Elders made noises that were not concern and were concern. Men calculated and told themselves they were not calculating. John felt a small quiver in his mouth sometimes as if the body asks to speak even when the head refuses permission, and he bit the inside of his cheek and counted to calm down. And then he took Ghost out along the low ground and walked until the cold became a truth that told the lesser ones to wait. The wolf followed a scent John could not read and then lost it and put his nose in the air and snuffed once, twice, a small, thoughtful sound. In the distance, a bird made a noise too thin for music and too sustained to be simple fear. John touched the seam of his cloak where the linen bundle lay like a thought he did not examine when the day had gone well in other respects. He whispered his mother's name once, purely to hear how it would sound in a mouth he had never used it in. The sound surprised him. It resembled neither his father's voice nor any he would lay at Rieger's feet, as if a third person had lent their tone for the occasion. He did not permit himself to use the name again aloud, which is a way to make any word increase its weight until it becomes a stone you cannot lift. He carried it differently, in silence. It made him kinder without making him softer, a thing no boy plans to achieve and few men believe they have. In the yard, when Rast snapped at PYP and PYP snapped back, John cut across their words and made fun of both with equal precision and then put his hand on each shoulder, one at a time, his palm heavy, and walked away, and both boys stood for a stunned instant before they remembered to be boys and resumed their bickering in a key that shifted from bitterness to habit. Later PYP said to Gren, "He has learned to be a man and keep a boy's kindness." And Gren said, "Don't tell him, he'll break it trying to look at it." A raven came with a small letter whose seal was smashed as if a thumb had been too eager. It carried a line that made Bowen Marsh raise his eyebrows and made Thorne mutter a comment about the literary aspirations of lesser lords. John caught only the phrase "beyond the woodline at night" and something about dogs not taking a scent, and he saw Donal Noy pause very briefly in the doorway of the hall and then carry on. The pause told him everything he needed to know about how concerned to be. He slept badly and woke with his knuckles sore, as if he had spent the night punching the inside of his dreams to get out. On a day when the heavy snow briefly smartened into crisp, bright air, John went out with a small party to cut wood and carry it where the carts could not fit. The woods on the south side of the wall are not most men's idea of sacred. Trees like gray pillars, the ground a carpet of needles with smells men learn in childhood and forget to prize because they are ordinary. ghost went ahead and returned. The men were glad of him and pretended not to be. PYP, who was good with an axe without being strong, made a regular rhythm to his blows that meant he could work longer than another would by husbanding his body's foolishness. Gren hauled like 2 men when he liked you and like half a man when he did not. Today he liked them. Halder told a story about carving and how the grain tells you what you cannot do. Wood and men share this habit closely. John felt watched twice by nothing and stood very still and listened to the listening. It felt like the moment in the godswood when a bird lands and does not move and the world holds its breath to see if that stillness will be broken by sound or by another stillness. He signaled to Ghost with a small motion, and the wolf went ahead with his body as relaxed as a lake and his nose working. The feeling passed. When they returned to the yard in the pale light, with hands that ached and faces that burned pleasantly, Alistair Thorne had the look of a man waiting to spend a joke. "Our Lord returns without antlers," he said of John's party, and it wasn't worth answering. That evening, while the stew made in its pot a set of noises that had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with endurance, Maester Eamon told a story loud enough for the first 2 tables to hear, about a time when ravens did not come and men had to carry words on their own bodies. He described the shape of that labor with none of the pride he might have allowed himself, only an interest in the way people invent solutions when humble needs press. "We tie our truths to the nearest moving thing," he said. "We hope it does not decide to sleep in a tree and be eaten." John walked Ghost along the inner path and thought of a truth tied to a small gray bird, one of the nameless, and how it might rest under a leaf and be forgotten for a season and then fly out smelling of rot and grace both, and be delivered to a hand that had waited so patiently it had lost the shape of waiting. He imagined his father opening such a letter. He let the image go before it could cleave him. He went to the rookery on a morning when his fingers felt like they belonged to a worse man and stood under the cascade of arc and wing that fills a room like that. The birds comported themselves like hard questions, occasionally all taking to the air at once, then settling again without apparent cancellation. Clydas, with his odd, careful paunch and eyebrows like twigs left in a pond, showed him a bird with a beak slightly crooked. "This one cannot be trusted to deliver what it is given," Clydas said serenely. "So we give it nothing. Survives. There is a lesson there." He scratched the bird's head as if it were a dog and looked at John as if John might enjoy being scratched behind the ears as well. John did not. In the yard, the training took on a shape that would not fit a song because it had too many repetitions and not enough cleverness. It was the music real life uses when no one listens. John found himself, to his surprise, less interested in proving he could put another boy on his back than in making sure he himself had no surprises when the dark fell and asked him to prove he could wake. He had always thought of himself as a boy waiting to be a man in the sense of a sword drawn and presented. He began to think of himself as a man waiting to be a man in the sense of a man putting his boots beside the bed neatly for waking in the night, and not tripping on them. The change unsettled him and comforted him in equal measure. Through it all, the parcel in his seam and the packet of letters under his pallet waited like the steady flame of a small lamp one is not sure when to trim. He took the ring out once in the deep night and slid it onto his finger. It fit too narrowly and made the finger feel increased in importance and threat both. He took it off again and put it to his lips without meaning to and tasted nothing but metal's indifference. He set it back with care and lay awake imagining a finger that belonged to a girl he had never touched wearing it and making bread with the hands that wore it. And then he forced himself to think of other things because the shape of a life he could not have had no right to be this warm under his blanket. On the wall a week later, with a moon like a split bone and air that had a sound like glass held under water, John stood with his hands inside his sleeves and let one layer of cold and then another go through. Jach him and kept his jaw steady by humming under his breath. Not a tune, only a note. The man beside him, older, who had scars like a shorthand for winter and for other men's short tempers, said, without looking, "Hear that?" John listened and heard only his own blood and the wind's dictionary. Then the sound came, a far, thin thing like a pipe someone blows badly on a lower slope. It did not come from above or below easily. It gave itself little bursts to the ear, and the mind did the rest and made of it a shape. The older man said, "Fox," after they had both listened a long while, and John nodded, though if someone had said, child," softly in the same tone. He might have nodded at that too. They stood until their feet told them to do something else and then did it. Letters from the south shifted the weather in the hall for a week. A rumor about the hand that grew legs and then fell, and someone said something else, and Thorne said something to make sport of Eddard Stark's defects. That he was too honest for men who liked their rules to bend when they needed them to flax. And Jon's throat worked a little and then stopped and he said nothing. Later PYP put a piece of twine into a loop in Jon's cloak with a knot that would release easily. The way PYP always had to do something with his hands when the room had become too full. Jon did not mention it. They sat a while in a corner and said little, and PYP finally said, "I wish my father had a name that other men spoke so often for such reasons." And Jon said, "I wish mine did not." And they were both telling the truth, and they both knew that helped nothing and everything. Benjen did not return. The maps room saw more men than it liked. Bowen Marsh's lips took on a chewed look. Donal Noy hammered less and listened more when men he didn't like walked past his door. Jon felt the shape of fear in the castle change. It became smaller and more numerous, like mice when the grain runs low. He forced himself to do the same things he had done the day before. Oil on leather, the way one checks the teeth of a thing a man may have to bite down on later just to survive. He spoke twice to Maester Eamon without asking for a name and felt better. And then he stood on the wall and said nothing and also felt better for that. One night when the snow came down in a fine old habit and the world drew close to listen to those who were willing to speak sense, Jon found himself by the fire beside a man who had not given his name but had given him a whetstone twice, without being asked, when Jon's had gone missing. They talked about the way the snow will form a ridge against a low wall, and how if you shift the wall 1 foot in a storm you can change the shape of the drift. And the man said, "It's not so different with men." And Jon said, "The wall makes its own men." And the man grunted as if he had both agreed and refused to admit it. After the first month, he noticed he was no longer counting. His hands had acquired the look of hands that had given up on ever being clean in the way southern boys like to be clean. The cold had gone into him and made space for itself the way a guest who pays as he stays may do. His truth lay where it had lain, changing without changing. He carried it more lightly on some days, like a basket with a secret beneath 3 loaves. On other days it weighed as if someone had put stones between the bread on a cruel lark. He did not tell it, even to a door. He found himself able to hear men speak about kings and dead princes and their sweethearts in towers without snarling. Not because the talk did not touch him now, but because he understood he would have to live a long while with men's talk. He had made a choice in the crypts when he told his father he would go. He would make the rest of the choices on nights like this, when no one watched, with a small thing. A can of oil, a perfectly mended strap, a kindness to a boy he did not like. He dreamed again of the tower, a little, and again of the river with rubies, and again of a ring that fitted, and he woke each time in the same shape in the same bed with the same wolf at his feet. The dreams changed nothing and everything, which is the way dreams are. He held himself very still after them and felt the passage of cold through him until he could name it without hating it. He thought of his father each day and each day less angrily for giving him this weight, because he had begun to understand the difference between a burden and a thing to carry. He thought of his mother seldom and then with a suddenness that bit him, and he softened toward himself because his own softening would be the only he would be given. He thought of Arya in the south as a flame, and of Robb as the glow in a hearth that a man relies on in winter and misses too late when it dies down through his fault. He thought of Sansa in a room with bright things and chose not to imagine her alone. He thought of a woman with hair bound in blue thread and let the thought be of hands, not a face, because hands you can imagine and they do not betray you by being less beautiful than your crude longing. He set his face each morning to the north and kept it there when Thorne tried to turn him towards small humiliations, and when boys' jests cut and when men's silences did. He polished his blade and bent when Donal Noy said bend and stood when Noy said stand. He listened to an old man who called him boy and told him he stood too straight and who told him 3 true things for every 6 he held back, and he did not resent the small ration of it. He did not make of his secret a cornucopia. He made of it a flint. He learned to strike it only when he needed a spark. The nights came and the days came and winter did its work, and Jon Snow, who knew the shape of his parentage like a ring under his clothes, went on with the business of becoming himself, and the wall kept its counsel by singing under the wind in a voice men pretend is only a sure sting of ice when they are tired and need to believe there is nothing more than weather to contend with.